Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Comparative Economics Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Kelly, and today I'm joined with some of economics' most intelligent analysts, Vito and Patrick, who specialize in the early Roman Empire, and John and Alex, who are experts in the ancient Egyptian economic background. I'll start with you, Vito. Can you tell us a little bit about how the population grew in the Roman Empire?
Well, due to the vastness of the empire and its large population, Rome had a high demand for goods and trade. The Romans improved many trade routes and created new routes between spanning from England all the way to China and India. They built harbors, canals, a vast system of roads. And during this time, the peacetime in Rome, they provided order and stability for the global trade. The Roman Empire's army protected the roads and sea routes for safe trade. These routes were very important for the trade to sustain and expand their growing population needs as they grew and conquested throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. They had an estimated population of around 4 million at the start of the empire, and they reached around 50 to 75 million, even 100 million estimates, which spanned over about 2.3 million square miles. And besides their extensive trade routes, Rome also provided a few free services for the population, such as free distribution of food and water, education. And due to education, they had very high literacy rates, which you can see through their very extensive records that they kept over their empire.
Okay,
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to continue talking about the early Roman Empire. So, Patrick, can you explain to us what one big lesson that future institutional frameworks should take away from the early Roman Empire?
Of course. Well, thank you for having us, Dylan. The one thing I think we can see, especially from the Roman Empire, is the biggest takeaway is how important the market forces played in the Roman economy, and how this has contributed to the economic growth and even sustainability of the Roman Empire. Just a little background: the early Roman Empire really had a well-functioning product, labor, and capital markets. The people were paid wages more in terms of the larger organizations like mines, whereas the craftsmen, they sold their products in exchange for some social support. And as we know, Roman Empire, these monuments, these monumental buildings gave rise to the free labor market, with workers exchanging their work activity for wages. And basically, this monumental building really gave rise to workers switching activity from one to the next. Unfortunately, there was the usage of slaves, so this counters that claim of a free labor market. But another thing to note on this and this structure of the market economy was how it was a cash basis with no public borrowing. The monetary system was actually based on the silver denarius, but the Roman Empire did loan money to fund capital, whether it be for consumption, production, investments, or trade. And these merchants, speaking of, were really the focal point of the capital markets, as their market was really based on trade and establishing different structures, such as the well-known arc, and other technological innovations such as baths, theaters, aqueducts, and cities. Just to point out, and one last point that I'll make, is the Pont du Gard. This was actually used to bring water from the town of Arles, those residents, and it was used for bathing or drinking, but at the same time, it was also used for irrigation and milling grain at the same time. So that you can see here is how they used water as an efficient energy source for production.
Thank you very much, Patrick and Vito. It's always very interesting learning about how all these different policies and whatnot from the early Roman Empire have had an effect on current economies now and future economies to come. So we will now transition into ancient Egypt, where John and Alex will provide us with some of their expertise. I'd like to start by asking John about the Egyptian currency and how it is traded.
Yeah, so In ancient Egypt, they actually had no coins or paper currency. They used what was called the barter system, which is when you trade goods and services in exchange for other goods and services. The main things that ancient Egypt would trade would be grain, gold, linen, finished goods like pottery, glass objects. They would mostly trade for copper, iron. They traded along the Nile River. The Nile River was mostly the life source for ancient Egypt. They would flood mostly like once a year, which would make the land very fertile for the grain. They traded mostly with the Sudan, the Lebanon, and the Canaan. That's really it.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Now, similarly to how we discussed the population growth in the early Roman Empire, I'm curious what insight Alex can provide in regards to the population growth in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, that's a great question, but it's not an easy one to answer. As we know, Egypt has a lot of documentations for many things. Ironically, population isn't really one of them. So due to this direct lack of evidence, there has been large various estimates of population have been made throughout history. However, because of the variability of all the evidence, we get different total population numbers of what it really was in specific periods. So using this form of system created by American geographer Carl Bootser, there's 3 steps that we could take to calculate this. So for one, an estimate of the likely total area of the cultivable land available at the time in each of 3 productive zones of Egypt, which would be the valley, delta, and the ferium. Second, the carrying capacity of the cultivable land, which is its population density. It's worked out from knowing what size population could be supported by food production on that area of land. And 3, the total population of each region, calculated by multiplying its land area by its carrying capacity. Now, we could tie this in with the system in which they lived in throughout those ancient times. Egypt was mostly self-sufficient, as householders would hold many goods for the future or exchanged by barter, as John mentioned, on the market, which played a key role in keeping the economy alive. The population was a vast majority, more than 9/10 during the first 2 millennia of ancient Egypt history. Didn't include as much slavery as they would later on. Religion played a large role in shaping the minds of all, as lands belonged to many gods in which they believed in. Most of the population were farm laborers on the estates of noble families and temples. The farmers were under labor tax and were required to work on irrigation or certain construction projects in the form of unpaid labor, which one could consider a form of slavery. The practice of labor was initially not as present, but during the Egyptian New Kingdom, it saw a large spike. Finally, the population more than doubled from 850,000 at the start of the 3rd millennium to over 2 million by 1800 BCE. Steady growth then followed from just under 1 million inhabitants in the pre-dynastic era to over 5 million in the Roman Byzantine times. Then finally, during the New Kingdom, this leads to a population total of approximately 2.5 to 3 million. During the New Kingdom, it also went as high as 7.5 million. And that's all.
Wow. Thank you very much, Alex. That was tremendous. I feel like I've definitely gotten tremendous amount of insight from all of you guys about the different economies in early Roman Empire and in ancient Egypt, and how these have affected the present and future institutional frameworks across the world. So I'd like to thank you guys one last time for coming on the show, and I'd like to give you guys each the floor one last time for a final remark. I'm going to start with Patrick, then go Vito, then Alex, then we'll close it up with John.
Great. Thank you so much, Dylan. I think one thing I just want to hit home is how we can learn from the structure of how the Roman Empire was set up in terms of being a market economy based, and really seeing how that can translate into our society now, as even just noting why the Roman Empire ended, just due to the rising inflation, education declined, as well as some of the banks began to disappear. there was still a presence of the markets, but not necessarily a market economy. So I think it's really important to see the importance of how this market economy contributed to the early success of the Roman Empire, and really take it with some consideration into seeing how it can be applied to our lives.
And to add on to Patrick, yes, we have to talk about how the market economy allowed for a lot of free trade between all these countries and, well, empires in Europe, Rome, China, England, Egypt, to allow for these merchants to efficiently trade safely between all these countries, to allow for a prosperous Roman Empire with a very fast growing population. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say that despite how removed we are from ancient times in Egypt and the Roman Empire, you could really see examples of how the economy we recognize now initially started. So I think it's important for all of us to have some form of knowledge as to the origins of a lot of things, and how some of these things haven't really left. For example, in Egypt, we see how there was slavery, and we flash forward to American history now, we see that slavery, we're not that far removed from it. So I think it's very eye-opening and influential to really recognize and just see how sometimes history repeats itself even in these systems. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on to Alex, with history repeating itself, you can see it even in ancient Egypt with the social class systems, how they had the upper class, the middle class, the lower class. I mean, it's in America now. You have a struggling lower class, and you have all these billionaires, all the upperclassmen. You know, the middle class is the working class. It's kind of the same exact thing, just years later.
Thank you guys again.